The Gala Reckoning. In front of 500 elite guests, the music died. Charles McCall didn't whisper, he used the microphone. He humiliated her. "Sign the divorce papers if you're brave, Meredith," he sneered, sliding the leather folder across the podium. "Let's see how long you last in the real world without my name. You'll be nothing." Meredith didn't cry. She didn't even hesitate. She signed the papers in 10 seconds with a steady hand and a terrifying smile. And then 7 Bugattis, engines roaring like beasts, silently lined up at the grand entrance of the museum she had designed. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. The Blueprint of Us. Some love stories begin with a spark. Meredith's began with a storm. She was 22 years old, tucked into a corner booth of a dim university cafe, her caramel skin glowing under the soft amber light of her desk lamp. She was surrounded by blueprints and charcoal dust, sketching the skeleton of a bridge that looked more like art than engineering. A smudge of graphite darkened her temple where she'd pushed back a stray lock of hair. She was lost in the mathematics of beauty when she felt a presence. Charles McCall stood 5 feet away, a charcoal grey suit looking far too expensive for a student haunt. He'd come in to escape the Georgia rain, intending to stay only long enough for his driver to pull around. Then he saw Meredith, not because of her striking features, though they were undeniable, but because of her focus. She looked like she was building a world, and he wanted to be the one to own it. He walked over, uninvited, and stood at the edge of her table until she looked up. "That bridge won't just hold weight," he said, his voice deep and certain. "It looks like it's trying to fly." Meredith didn't pull away. She tilted her head, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Structures should dream, too," she replied. "I'm Charles," he said, extending a hand that felt like power. "Meredith. Do you know anything about load-bearing walls, Charles?" "I know I've never seen a blueprint look like a poem before," he said. He sat down. For the next 3 hours, they talked about nothing mundane and everything ambitious. She told him about her dream of sustainable cities, he told him about his hunger to disrupt the tech world. When they finally left, the rain was a deluge. Without a word, he draped his heavy wool coat over her shoulders, shielding her from the cold, and promised she would never have to worry about the storm again. The university cafe smelled of roasted beans and wet pavement as the rain lashed against the tall windows, blurring the world outside into a charcoal smear. Meredith sat in her usual corner booth, her desk lamp casting a warm glow over the intricate blueprints spread before her. Her fingers, dusted with graphite and charcoal, moved with the precision of a surgeon as she sketched the support beams of a bridge that defied traditional physics. To anyone else, it was a mess of lines and angles, but to Meredith, it was a poem written in steel. She was so deeply immersed in the structural integrity of her dream bridge that she didn't hear the bell above the door chime or notice the man who stood just beyond the circle of her lamp's light. Charles McCall was then a man on the verge of his first billion, possessed of an intensity that made the air around him feel charged. He had ducked into the cafe to escape the Georgia deluge, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the linoleum, but he stopped short when he saw her. He didn't see just a woman, he saw a creator. He watched her for a long moment, captivated by the way her brow furrowed in concentration and the way her caramel skin seemed to soak up the light. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rich baritone that cut through the low hum of the espresso machine. "A bridge like that doesn't just span a river," he said, stepping into the light. "It challenges the sky." Meredith looked up, startled, a stray lock of dark hair falling across her eyes. She didn't see a billionaire, he wasn't one yet. She saw a man who looked at her work and actually understood it. Most people just ask if it's over budget, she replied, a small, guarded smile playing on her lips. Budget is for people without vision, Charles countered, sliding into the seat opposite her without being asked. That night, they talked until the cafe staff began stacking chairs on tables. He spoke of a digital empire that would change how the world communicated, and she spoke of cities that breathed, structures that lived in harmony with the earth. He looked at her not as a trophy to be won, but as a force to be harnessed. The early years of their marriage were a whirlwind of shared ambition. They were a power couple in the truest sense, the architect and the innovator. Meredith remembered the late nights in their first real apartment, where they would spread their work out on the floor, their shoulders touching. Charles would lean over her shoulder, his hand resting on the small of her back, as she explained the load-bearing capacity of a new glass alloy. "We're going to build the future together, Mia," he would whisper into her hair. "Your steel, my code. We'll be untouchable." In those days, his possessiveness felt like a shield. When a contractor spoke down to her on a job site, Charles would arrive like a thunderstorm, demanding they show the lead architect the respect she deserved. She felt seen, protected, and elevated. He was the wind beneath her wings, pushing her to design the headquarters for his rising tech empire, a building that would eventually become a landmark of the city skyline. She lived in the intoxicating belief that they were equals building a kingdom. She didn't notice when our vision slowly started to become his legacy. She didn't see the way he began to subtly suggest she take a break from outside contracts to focus solely on his projects. At the time, it felt like a partnership, a divine alignment of two souls destined for greatness. She was the master builder, and he was her greatest champion, or so she thought, as she watched the first skyscraper of their life together rise toward the clouds, never realizing that the very man who helped her build it was already planning how to trap her within its walls. The transition from partner to possession happened so slowly that Meredith initially mistook the tightening of her world for the embrace of a grander life. It began on a night that should have been the pinnacle of their joint success. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and triumph. Charles had just been named Tech Visionary of the Decade, and as he stood on stage, bathed in a spotlight that seemed to turn his eyes into cold flint, he looked every bit the king he had always intended to be. Meredith sat in the front row, her heart swelling with a pride she thought was mutual, wearing a gown the color of liquid gold that matched the warmth of her skin. When they returned to their sprawling penthouse, a glass-walled fortress she had helped design, the silence of the house felt heavy. Charles didn't take off his jacket. He poured 2 fingers of scotch and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city as if it were a game board. "You don't need to do it anymore, Meredith," he said, his back to her. His voice was smooth, devoid of the excitement he'd shown on stage. Meredith paused, her hand halfway to unclasping her diamond necklace. "Do what, Charles?" "The City Commission project? I'm nearly finished with the structural phase." "Any of it," he replied, finally turning to look at her. "The drafting, the late nights, the stress of dealing with contractors. I've reached the summit. My wife shouldn't be covered in charcoal dust and arguing with site foremen. It looks unseemly. You've done your part in building the foundation. Now, I want you to enjoy the view." "I enjoy the work, Charles. It's who I am," she said, a small flicker of unease lighting in her chest. He walked over, his movements predatory and graceful, and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Who you are is my wife. The face of the McCall legacy. I've already taken the liberty of calling your office. I told your staff that you're taking an indefinite sabbatical. I've provided them all with very generous severance packages. They were thrilled. The blood drained from Meredith's face. "You fired my team?" "Without asking me." "I freed you," he corrected, his grip tightening just enough to be felt. "I need you by my side for the foundation galas, the diplomatic dinners, the board retreats. You are the architect of our social world now, Meredith. That requires your full attention. Why build a bridge for a city that doesn't appreciate you when you can be the queen of the one I've already built?" In the weeks that followed, the sabbatical became a permanent state of being. Her home office, once filled with the scent of vellum and the scratching of pencils, was transformed into a secondary walk-in closet for her gala wardrobe. Her emails were redirected to a social secretary hired by Charles, a woman named Elena who managed Meredith's life with the clinical efficiency of a prison warden. Meredith found herself draped in haute couture, standing at charity luncheons where the conversations were as hollow as the champagne flutes. She was no longer asked about load-bearing capacities or urban sustainability, she was asked about the vintage of the wine and the designer of her shoes. Whenever she tried to steer the conversation back to her craft, Charles would expertly intervene, sliding an arm around her waist and pulling her back into his orbit. "My wife is far too modest," he would tell the laughing crowd. "She's retired her drafting tools to focus on the most important project of all, me." He had traded her blueprints for menus and her charcoal for diamonds. She was no longer a builder, she was a centerpiece. And as she looked at her reflection in the gilded mirrors of the high society circuit, Meredith realized the light Luke had seen in her years ago was beginning to flicker. She was living in a masterpiece of her own design, but for the first time, she realized she was the only thing in the building that was truly trapped. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, where Meredith discovers the true extent of Charles's sabotage? The silence in the McCall penthouse was usually a source of peace, but lately, it felt like the thin air of a mountain peak, hard to breathe and devoid of life. Meredith moved through the cavernous halls like a ghost in her own design, her footsteps muffled by silk rugs that cost more than her first year's tuition. Charles was away in Tokyo for a merger, leaving behind a home that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a museum where she was the primary exhibit. The discovery happened by accident, a glitch in the controlled environment Charles had constructed around her. A courier had arrived with a package intended for Charles, but the digital signature pad had defaulted to her name. Inside was a thick, leather-bound architectural brief for the new Atlanta waterfront project, the very commission Meredith had spent 3 years lobbying for before she had retired. Curiosity, sharp and painful, pricked at her chest. She opened the folder, expecting to see a competitor's name on the winning bid. Instead, she found a series of internal memos from the City Planning Commission. Her eyes blurred as she read a letter on McCall Enterprises stationery, dated 6 months prior. It wasn't a recommendation, it was a withdrawal. Due to personal health concerns and a desire to focus on her family, Meredith McCall is officially withdrawing her candidacy for the waterfront project. We request that all future inquiries regarding her professional availability be directed through my office. The letter was signed by Charles. Meredith felt a cold, hollow sensation cave in her ribs. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was the calculated precision of the sabotage. He hadn't just told her she didn't need to work, he had systematically burned the bridges she had spent a decade building. She turned the pages and found more, a blocked contract for a sustainable housing initiative in Savannah, a politely declined invitation to keynote the National Architects Summit, and even a redirected scholarship fund she had set up for young women in STEM. Every time she had sat across from him at dinner, mourning the changing industry for the lack of interest in her designs, he had comforted her with expensive wine and empty promises, all while holding the shears that were clipping her wings. He didn't want her to be a partner, he wanted her to be a parasite, wholly dependent on the nutrients he chose to provide. She walked into her former studio, now a sterile dressing room filled with rows of designer heels and evening bags that looked like jeweled cages. She sat on the velvet ottoman and looked at her hands that used to be stained with ink and calloused from holding drafting scales. They were soft now, manicured to perfection, and utterly useless. The realization hit her with the force of a structural collapse. Charles wasn't protecting her from the world, he was protecting his ego from her light. In his mind, her success was a threat to his dominance. He didn't want a queen who could build her own throne, he wanted a consort who knew her place was at his feet. For years, she had blamed herself for losing her passion, thinking she had simply grown soft in the lap of luxury. But as she gripped the edges of the mahogany vanity, her knuckles turning white, the flicker of the architect returned. She saw the structural flaws in her marriage with devastating clarity. Charles thought he had demolished her foundation, but he had forgotten one thing: Meredith was a builder. And builders knew that sometimes you have to tear a structure down to its very studs before you can build something that will never fall. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the expensive crystal decanter against the glass walls. Instead, she carefully tucked the memos back into the folder and placed it exactly where she had found it. Charles would return from Tokyo expecting a submissive wife ready to host his next victory dinner. He wouldn't see the blueprint she was already beginning to draw in the dark of her mind. He wanted her to serve? Fine. She would serve him a version of herself so perfect, so invisible, that he would never notice her laying the dynamite under the life he thought he owned. Meredith became a master of the double life, a ghost haunted by her own potential. By day, she was the impeccable Mrs. McCall, a woman whose most taxing decision was the floral arrangement for a gala or the vintage of a Chardonnay. She sat through endless, vapid luncheons, nodding at the right intervals while her mind was miles away, calculating the wind load factors of a skyscraper in Dubai or the thermal mass of a desert retreat in Morocco. Charles looked at her and saw a successfully tamed creature, a jewel that stayed exactly where he placed it. He had no idea that beneath the silk and the smiles, the architect was waking up. When the clock struck midnight and the penthouse fell into a heavy, expensive silence, Meredith's true day began. While Charles slept the deep, arrogant sleep of a man who believed he owned everything his eyes touched, Meredith slipped into the small guest suite at the far end of the northern wing. She had convinced Charles it was her meditation room, a place for quiet reflection that he found too boring to ever enter. In the darkness of that room, illuminated only by the blue light of a high-powered laptop she had bought with cash and hidden under the floorboards, Meredith transformed. She cast off the alias of the billionaire's wife and became Stone. She worked with a feverish, desperate hunger, her fingers flying across the keys and her stylus dancing over the digital tablet. She wasn't just designing buildings, she was designing her escape. The pseudonym was her shield. Under the name Stone, she entered the Pritzker-level international design competitions that Charles had blocked her from in the real world. She submitted a proposal for the Neo-Tokyo Library, a structure that mimicked the organic flow of a river, and won the silver medal. She designed a sustainable housing complex in Berlin that utilized carbon-sequestering concrete, winning the Innovation of the Year award from a prestigious London firm. The irony was a bitter medicine. Her work was being celebrated by the global elite, analyzed in journals Charles read over breakfast, yet he had no idea the visionary newcomer he praised to his colleagues was the woman currently pouring his coffee. Once, at a dinner party, she watched him point to a magazine feature on Stone's latest project. Now this, Charles had said, tapping the image of a cantilevered museum, is a mind that understands power. You could learn a thing or two from this stone person, Meredith. This is real architecture, not the idealistic sketches you used to do. Meredith had simply smiled, a cold, sharp thing she kept tucked behind her teeth. "I'll keep that in mind, Charles," she said softly. With every win, her secret offshore account grew. The prize money from the competitions and the consulting fees from firms desperate to hire the mysterious stone were being funneled into a trust Charles couldn't touch. She was building a foundation of solid gold beneath her feet, even as she continued to play the role of the submissive, silent partner. She was no longer just a wife, she was a competitor lurking in his own house. She was the shadow architect, and the structure she was most proud of wasn't made of steel or glass, it was the invisible empire she was building right under the nose of the man who thought he had already won. The arrogance of a predator often lies in the belief that the prey has forgotten how to fight. For months, Charles had basked in the quietude of his home, convinced that Meredith had finally settled into the decorative mold he had cast for her. But the structural integrity of his control began to hairline fracture on a Tuesday afternoon, sparked by nothing more than a misplaced tablet and a moment of uncharacteristic domestic curiosity. Charles had entered the meditation room looking for a misplaced charger, his mind already halfway to a board meeting. He saw Meredith's leather-bound portfolio tucked behind a stack of yoga mats, a relic of her past life, or so he thought. He opened it, expecting to find old student sketches or perhaps sentimental doodles of their early days. Instead, he found the blueprint for the Neo-Tokyo Library. The technical brilliance of the drawing was undeniable. It was a masterclass in cantilevered grace, signed with the unmistakable flourish of Stone. But it was the handwritten marginalia that stopped his heart, Meredith's shorthand, her specific way of calculating tensile strength, and a date stamp from only 3 weeks ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't been meditating, she had been conspiring. She was the shadow that had been outshining him in the architectural journals he read every morning. The woman he had spent years making small had been growing a secret universe behind his back. Rage, cold and sharp as a glass shard, crystallized in his chest. He didn't see her talent as a marvel, he saw it as an act of high treason. When Meredith returned from a charity fitting, she found Charles sitting in the living room, the portfolio resting on his lap. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply looked at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that promised a reckoning. "I found your little hobby, Meredith," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. "It's quite impressive. Stone. A clever bit of fiction." Meredith stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Charles, I can explain." "There's no need," he interrupted, standing up and smoothing the front of his bespoke suit. "I realize now that I've been too indulgent. I thought you wanted peace, but it seems you still have a taste for the spotlight. You want the world to see you? Fine. I'll make sure they see exactly who you are." He spent the next 3 days in a state of manic, terrifying productivity. He didn't block her access or take her keys. Instead, he began making calls to the organizers of the upcoming McCall Foundation Gala, the most anticipated event on the social calendar. He wasn't going to just divorce her, he was going to dismantle her. He would wait for the moment when she felt most secure, surrounded by the 500 most influential people in the country, and he would strip away her dignity until she was nothing but a cautionary tale of a wife who forgot her place. He would prove, once and for all, that while she might be able to draw a building, he was the one who owned the land it stood on. He was the architect of her ruin, and the gala would be his masterpiece. The air in the McCall penthouse grew thin, chilled by a politeness that felt like a razor's edge. Charles was behaving with a terrifying, oily smoothness, his eyes tracking Meredith's every movement with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a specimen in a jar. He didn't mention Stone again. Instead, he became obsessed with the logistics of the upcoming gala, insisting Meredith wear a custom-made gown of silver silk that looked less like a dress and more like a suit of armor. He was checking her schedule, her phone logs, and her movements with a renewed vigor that signaled the walls were finally closing in. Meredith felt the shift in the foundation long before the first crack appeared. She had spent a decade studying structural integrity. She knew when a building was preparing to collapse. Every time Charles brushed her cheek with a cold hand or whispered about their bright future in front of the help, she felt the vibrations of his impending strike. He wasn't planning to ignore her secret life, he was planning to weaponize it. Working in the feverish silence of her meditation room, Meredith initiated her final contingency plan. Her fingers danced over the encrypted keyboard of her hidden laptop, moving with a speed born of pure survival instinct. She began the process of liquidating her secret earnings, the prize money from Tokyo, the consulting fees from London, and the royalties from her innovative concrete patents. She watched the numbers scroll across the screen, a digital tally of her worth that had nothing to do with the McCall name. With a series of clicks that sounded like gunshots in the quiet room, she funneled every cent into the Ariadne Trust, an offshore private entity she had established months ago. It was a labyrinthine financial structure that even Charles's army of forensic accountants would struggle to pierce. She moved her intellectual property, every blueprint, every sketch, and every structural calculation, into a secure digital vault. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Atlanta skyline on the morning of the gala, Meredith McCall was technically a ghost. On paper, she owned nothing. In reality, she was the wealthiest she had ever been. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up. Below, the museum she had designed gleamed in the early light, a testament to what she could build when she wasn't being stifled. She knew that by tomorrow, her life as the billionaire's trophy would be over. The trap was set, but Charles had made the fatal error of assuming he was the only hunter in the room. He thought he was preparing a public execution, but Meredith had spent the week building a bridge. As she turned to face the silver dress hanging on the door, her reflection in the glass was no longer that of a victim. She was the architect of her own escape, and tonight, she would let him think he was tearing her down, right up until the moment she showed him that she had already moved the ground from beneath his feet. The museum ballroom was a cathedral of glass and ego, filled with 500 of the most powerful people in the country. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the ceiling Meredith had engineered, casting a fractured light over the sea of tuxedos and silk. At the center of it all stood Charles McCall, looking every bit the conquering emperor. Beside him, Meredith was a vision in silver silk, her caramel skin radiant, though her eyes were as still as a deep-water lake. The music died with a sharp, orchestrated suddenness. Charles stepped to the marble podium, tapping the microphone. The sound echoed through the hall, a digital heartbeat that commanded absolute silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice dripping with a feigned, tragic solemnity. "Tonight was meant to be a celebration of legacy. But a legacy cannot be built on a foundation of lies." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Charles turned his gaze toward Meredith, his expression shifting into something cruel and predatory. He pulled a leather-bound folder from beneath the podium, the same folder that had once held her stolen dreams, and slid a set of divorce papers across the marble. "I discovered my wife has been playing a game," he announced to the room, his voice amplified to every corner. "She's been masquerading as a visionary, using my resources to fund a fantasy under a fake name. Meredith, if you're as brave as you are deceptive, sign these. Prove to everyone that you can survive without my name, my money, and my protection. Let's see what you're worth when you're just you." The air in the room vanished. People looked away, embarrassed by the raw brutality of the humiliation. Charles stood back, his arms crossed, waiting for the tears, the pleading, the frantic negotiation that would prove his total dominance. Meredith didn't flinch. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked toward the podium with a grace that felt like a slow-motion collapse of a building, controlled and inevitable. She looked down at the papers and then up at Charles. To his visible shock, she didn't cry. A low, melodic laugh bubbled up from her throat, a sound of genuine, mocking amusement that cut through the tension like a diamond saw. "You think this is my ending, Charles?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying even without the microphone. "You spent so much time trying to own the architect that you forgot to look at the structure you were standing in." She picked up the heavy gold pen and signed her name, not as Meredith McCall, but with a sharp, bold flourish of Stone. It took 10 seconds. When she finished, she slid the papers back toward him. "I've been waiting for you to realize I don't need your name," she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the ice in her tone. "I've already built a world where you don't exist." She turned and began to walk toward the grand entrance, the silver of her dress shimmering like moonlight on steel. Charles stood frozen, the smugness on his face curdling into a mask of confused rage. He opened his mouth to shout a final insult, but the sound was drowned out by a low, rhythmic thunder vibrating through the museum's foundation. Outside the glass walls, a line of headlights began to pierce the dark, moving with the synchronized precision of a royal guard. 7 Bugattis, each a masterpiece of engineering, pulled up to the curb in a silent, terrifying display of wealth and arrival. Meredith didn't look back at the man she had just left behind. She walked toward the light of the engines, leaving Charles standing alone in a room full of people who were already starting to forget his name. The roar of the engines outside was a primal, mechanical symphony that vibrated through the very glass Meredith had once labored to specify. As the heavy museum doors swung open, the humidity of the Georgia night rushed in, mingling with the scent of high-octane fuel and expensive leather. The line of 7 Bugattis sat idling at the curb, their sleek, aerodynamic bodies glowing like polished obsidian under the streetlights. This wasn't a getaway, it was an arrival. Charles stood paralyzed at the podium, the microphone still live, broadcasting the sound of his own shallow, ragged breathing to the stunned audience. His eyes darted from the signed divorce papers to the woman walking away from him, and finally to the line of hypercars. "Where do you think you're going?" he yelled, his voice cracking, the authority he had wielded for a decade evaporating in real time. "That's my security. Those are my guests. You have nothing, Meredith. You're walking out into a void." Meredith stopped just at the threshold of the grand entrance, her silver dress caught in the draft of the evening air. She turned back one last time, her expression not one of anger, but of a calm, architectural clarity. "You kept talking about the McCall legacy, Charles," she said, her voice amplified by the dead silence of the room. "But you stopped paying attention to the fine print. You were so busy trying to manage the image that you forgot to own the assets." She gestured to the soaring, cantilevered arches and the vast, unobstructed halls. "This museum was the crown jewel of your foundation. But 3 months ago, the debt on this land was restructured and purchased by an anonymous holding company. You thought you were hosting a gala in your own house, but you're just a tenant." She paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. "The holding company is Stone Structural Holdings. I am Stone, Charles. I don't just design the buildings. I own the ground they stand on. You have 30 days to vacate the board office." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The elite of the city, the people Charles had tried to impress by crushing his wife, were already turning their backs on him to catch a glimpse of the woman who had outmaneuvered a titan. The doors of the Bugattis opened in a synchronized wing-like motion. Out of the vehicle stepped 6 of the most influential developers and venture capitalists from Europe and Asia, Meredith's new board of directors. They didn't look at Charles, they looked at Meredith with the deference reserved for a peer. "The board is waiting, Meredith," said a woman in a sharp, midnight blue suit, stepping forward to meet her. "We have the blueprints for the Singapore project ready for your final approval." Meredith nodded, her hand grazing the cool carbon fiber of the lead car. She didn't look back at the man standing alone on the stage, suddenly small against the backdrop of the masterpiece he could no longer claim. She stepped into the car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud that sounded like the final period at the end of a long, suffocating sentence. As the convoy pulled away, the 7 engines roared in unison, a chorus of freedom that echoed through the streets of Atlanta, leaving the ghost of Meredith McCall behind in the dust and the shadow of the man who thought he could break her. 2 years later, the morning air atop the 104th floor of the Stone Zenith was crisp, thin, and tasted of absolute victory. Meredith stood on the edge of the observation deck, her caramel skin glowing in the high-altitude sun, looking down at a city she had physically reshaped. Below her, the museum where she had once been humiliated looked like a miniature model, a tiny box of glass and old memories. She was no longer dressed in the silver armor of a defensive wife. She wore a simple, expertly tailored suit of deep navy, the color of a midnight sky just before the dawn. Across town, the headlines told a different story. McCall Enterprises was a sinking ship, its hull breached by the very arrogance that had once fueled its rise. Charles had spent his fortune fighting a losing battle against the ghost of Stone, attempting to sue for intellectual property he never owned and projects he never understood. His reputation had curdled, the investors who once bowed to him had vanished the moment they realized he was merely a man who bought things, not a man who created them. He was a tenant in a world that had moved on, living in a shrinking kingdom of bitter shadows and empty boardrooms. But Meredith didn't look across town. She looked toward the horizon, where 3 more of her cranes were currently piercing the clouds. Her firm hadn't just survived the divorce, it had become the gold standard for a new era of architecture. She had built more than towers, she had built a culture of respect and brilliance, surrounding herself with creators who were encouraged to shine, not to serve. She was no longer the wife or even just the survivor. She was the master builder, a title earned through every late-night calculation and every silent rebellion. A young architect, a woman with the same fire in her eyes that Meredith had possessed in that rainy university cafe, stepped out onto the deck holding a digital tablet. The structural integrity of the Sky Bridge is holding at 100%, Ms. Stone. We're ready for the final beam. Meredith smiled, and for the first time in a decade, the expression was entirely for herself. Proceed, she said softly. She turned back to the view, leaning against the railing of the tower she had designed, funded, and owned. She thought briefly of the girl who had once let a man drape a coat over her shoulders to protect her from the rain. She wished she could tell that girl that the storm wasn't something to be feared, it was the very thing that tested the foundation. Charles had tried to be her ceiling, but he had only succeeded in becoming the floor she stepped on to reach the sky. As the sun reached its zenith, Meredith took a deep, steady breath. The air was cold, the height was dizzying, and the silence was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was the quiet of a masterpiece finished, of a life constructed with intent and steel. She wasn't disappearing into someone else's story anymore. She was the one who had drawn the lines. She was the one who had laid the stone. She was finally, irrevocably, home in a world of her own making. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.